All right, I think we're ready to get started. So hi, everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Compliance Automation to the Rescue. My name is Gulzar, and I'm on the marketing team at Chef. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I have a couple of housekeeping items to cover. If you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A section at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. For the best viewing experience, we recommend closing all additional programs or browser sessions since webinars are bandwidth intensive. And finally, as always, this webinar is being recorded and an on-demand of the presentation will be available for you in the next couple of days. So let's go ahead and get started. Alan and Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Gozar. Appreciate it. So we are here today. We're going to talk with you hopefully in the next 45 minutes to an hour. The more questions you get, the longer we'll stick around, and you'll get to interact with us. So we're going to be talking about compliance automation, and especially what we are calling and coining the human-free zone. So if you're curious to what that really means, you'll hopefully at the end of this webinar get a good understanding of where we stand and how we position this this human-free zone in the marketplace, specifically around compliance. I have the distinguished pleasure and honor to have Chris Medina here with me. Why don't you introduce yourself, Chris, before I go and start doing mine?
Whole spiel. Thanks, Alan. That's very gracious of you. I'm sure anybody who's on the webinar who knows me knows better than that. But my name is Chris Medina. I lead public sector practice here for Chef, the Chef division for Progress, and I've been doing this for a number of years. Grew up in the military, United States Navy, 9 years. And that was a long time ago. So I've been around the block a few times, but worked with some three-letter agencies and know my way around a keyboard every now and then when they let me. But I'm really excited to be here, Alan. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, it's always fun to kind of chat with you guys on compliance, especially you have a deep insight into it. So hi, everyone. I'm Alan Baptista. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager, specifically for Chef Compliance, which is our security and compliance solution. I've been at Chef, now Progress, for a little over 2 years with varying levels of experience in different organizations, always in the product marketing arena. So it's kind of fun to help translate the technical background into human speak. And more specifically, I've delved into compliance and security for the last 2 years, so still kind of learning there. I have a background in business. I grew up back in Brazil, so also a warm country. So always enjoying that sunny weather anywhere I can get it. So why don't we start chatting about how we position our compliance and security solutions. Driving compliance and securing systems sometimes really feels like plugging in holes to a dam, where once you kind of plug in one hole, you then another one pops up and you go over there and fix that one, and then you fix the third one, and you just kind of go in trying to fill in the holes and protect yourself. Ultimately, if you are finding those compliance failures kind of in production, it is kind of a failure for the entire organization. You've failed your organization in being able to be proactive and instead of reactive. Ideally, the sooner you can find those issues, those holes, and plug them before they're in production, the better. We see that there's a need for speed to deliver innovation, new code, or business value is at an all-time high, with every organization really trying to bring their application, their business solutions, or ultimately their business value to market faster. So there's a need for speed, right? But with speed comes at a cost to the organization. But at what, but this speed, does it really come at what cost to the organization? Is it a cost of quality of what is being put out there? Or even worse, is it a cost to the security of your entire ecosystem, all your systems and your environments? And we believe that there's this delicate balance that is needed between the need for speed and the ability of the organization to secure and maintain their systems, compliant. We have a Gartner report that really highlights that, and was done in October of 2019, where they state that balancing the speed and risk is only done by leveraging automation and implementing what they call compliance as code, which we'll get into defining a little bit more in the future. So why is there a need? Why is there this need for the balance of security and speed? Well, despite the velocity gains that have been obtained by other teams in the organization through adoption of Agile or Scrum, or even the adoption of DevOps within organizations, the information security teams are kind of still lagging a little bit behind. And that the continuous demand to increase speed potentially amplifies some existing issues. Breaches take a long time to find, and exploitations occur on known vulnerabilities. And then the remediation for those also takes time, and sometimes is very manual, very time intensive and manual efforts. For instance, the most recent Verizon data breach report of 2019 shows that 56% of breaches took months or longer to discover, and that since 2012, for more than 5 years now, most exploits observed, 90% in fact, use only 9 known vulnerabilities. And in a recent Chef survey that we did, we see that most companies take 2 months to complete their security audits. And 70% of these companies still release vulnerabilities at least once a year. How do you see this happening out there in the field, Chris, as you're visiting with customers and prospects?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you that the standard engineering answer is it sort of depends, right? It depends on what it is you're doing, what's your what does your productivity look like, and what does that mean to you from a government perspective? I've seen some government agencies take much longer than that. For instance, as an example, a large SI that I work with taking nearly 2 to 3 months just to deploy one server, or expenses in deploying VMs as high as $50,000. But that's pretty extreme, right? I mean, not everybody will have to incur some of those costs like the federal government does. I've got some commercial customers and enterprise customers who are looking at this, and the whole premise around it is how do we accelerate this process? I mean, it's eating in to budgets, it eats into my compensation, it eats into time and effort spent. It costs me go to market time and expenses, right? If I can beat my competition in market with that latest and greatest feature. There's so many things that are involved in this part of it, but these benchmarks are a real good example of kind of the norm that's out there. And so that really gives a lot of momentum for the need in automation.
And we are going to talk about how traditional approaches really kind of just exacerbate that pain that we currently see, right? We see that this is very long, kind of linear process that takes place. And then security is almost as an afterthought in many ways, right? where the security review is like the last mile before it's the lights are switched on. And those security reviews, like we said, are very manual, time consuming. They rely on scanning tools that generate this too much data, and it takes time to sift through and effectively manage that. We catch problems kind of too late in the process, and we really kind of have a difficulty managing expectations appropriately. How do you see this kind of traditional approach impacting organizations these days?
Yeah, so in a couple of ways, right? This is pretty standard waterfall looking thing. And I'm sure many of the people who are on today can relate to this. They'll probably also relate to, the marriage of, the development applications with the actual OS and infrastructure, right? That's oftentimes, a setback or a hurdle and time consuming from that standpoint. But in general, when it comes to compliance and auditing, understanding, whether or not my app and or my infrastructure moving through a pipeline is in alignment with what my standards are, or we call it ATO, or approval to operate. It could take, much longer than expected. So, if we can make this process any more agile, and hopefully we'll go into that a little bit deeper in a couple of slides, it really slows down the pace where people, provide or get engaged with automation, get all the things set up, and then only to find that, hey, I actually might even have slowed my process because I don't have that manual intervention, and I can't make it work as fast as I thought I could.
Very cool. And then we talked a little bit about how audits take too long and are labor intensive and whatnot. I really like this slide because I think it really exemplifies on how we see how we perceive, I guess, audits, because the assumption is that there's a struggle to remain compliant. And it's interesting that generally the assumed level of compliance is on the left-hand side there on that slide, where you see that it's very linear. The assumption is once you reach that level of compliance certification from the audit, that generally the decline is very linear and very slow. But in reality, what you see is that on the right-hand side, that these audits and assessments are, once they're done, the actual level of compliance falls drastically because systems are modified, are adapted. That instant, plus one pretty much inserts the factor that it is somewhat out of compliance. Then the only ability to truly remain compliant is to shorten the periods between the evaluation of audit compliance and your audit status, and the shorter they are, the more compliant you are. And enters the concept of kind of continuous compliance that we like to kind of talk about, right? And this is because the change of this compliance really takes time, and it's done throughout the system in different environments and different settings. So it's really, really hard to keep all your environment completely compliant. How do you see this kind of some assumed compliance and versus reality out there?
Yeah, this is, just like you said, you have to shorten the periods between audits in order to understand where true compliance is. That kind of speaks for itself. So, you see the dips in the chart on the right really are, the ops teams just rushing to the audit date to make everything in alignment and doing all the things that they need to do, which is typically long and drawn out. It's for security teams, it's not where they want to be. They'd rather be watching the front door and doing, cool things like looking for new, infiltration methods or different types of hacks or whatever. But typically 50% of their time is spent, hey, I've got to make sure that, production's in alignment. I've got, DevOps continuously creating, and distributing things, deploying things into production. And, the first thing that I'm going to walk into with the CISO is, hey, what's my risk assessment for the morning? What do I look like today? What's the latest hack? And, where's my risk so I can report up to the CIO? So, trying to get to that straight line across where you understand at any point in time, whether or not your system is compliant or not, really makes the difference in terms of your speed to market.
And there's also, and with, I'm sorry, with regards to audits, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but when you do an audit assessment, you pick like point samples of your entire estate, right? You go out and take a representation of a node that would potentially represent this entire section of your environment, and, and consequently you pick and choose a handful of those and assume that because that single element is compliant, your entire network is compliant. Is that really true?
Absolutely. It's we call it inferred, right? There would be no way we could handle, an entire audit of a huge enterprise system. But what we can do is we can trace back to either gold copies or distribution methods and say, hey, look, in say HR or in finance, we have a standard delivery. This is the type of infrastructure and applications that we're delivering. Here were the latest changes. Let me show you, a half a dozen of these boxes. And, depending on who's auditing you, and I've had some pretty picky people come through, third parties, DISA, CIS, a number of groups that'll come through, and they'll be the ones who will pick, and they'll just pick them at random. They'll pull a few, we'll dive down, we'll run some command lines, we'll look at ownerships, we'll look at access rights, we'll look at all of these types of things, but we won't do it across every server. So no, they're absolutely not getting a full view of what what we've got in production. It's called an inference, and that's what they typically go off of.
But we are able to kind of move away from inferencing when you're using an automated and a code compliance as code process, right?
That's absolutely right. But we have to be careful with the way that we scale those methodologies. You could, depending on what your method is going to be for an audit, you could either scan the fleet, which can give you some problems, right? Depending on your architectures, if you have firewalls in place, you have routing that's messed up, you have routing that's down. Those types of methods we have to be cautious about. And then, obviously with a client, and I've got a lot of end user security folks who are like, endpoint is the end all be all for everything. And typically when you suggest to them, hey, the answer to those poor architectures for network are going to be installing a client, well, then you start to run into overhead issues, taking up too much processing on the machine, or the machine wasn't designed to do that in terms of what it's serving, whatnot, what have you. So, it's really, what you have a tolerance for, what your methodologies are going to be. There can always be a mix of the two if you understand or have a number of tools, but then that gets complex, right? You get a bunch of stuff in there. So, having the best of both worlds is really where I like to be, or have the ability to give an auditor, a full scope of what it is that I'm doing in terms of alignment.
And the well, these audits and maintaining compliance and security of these systems is a team effort, right? Because we envision that there's a different set of teams, with each team has its own set of tools. They also have their set of priorities, and the way that they communicate with each other is somewhat almost as a foreign language in many ways, because there's definitely a balancing act that gets exacerbated by the fact that they have these different views, these different goals, and these different tools that they are using, right? The compliance officer likely has this, big binder of rules that they need to kind of check the box and make sure you follow. You'll have the security team that might have some level of scanning tools or validation tools in order to make sure that the systems are validated to what the standards are expected. And then you may have a DevOps team that is actually there to kind of fix the problem if they are uncovered, or make sure that all the configuration and the standards that are desired by the other two teams are made true. But the problem in that is that since all these teams are using these tools and different tools to evaluate things, there's a hard way to translate the process between one and another, right? The compliance regulation kind of needs to be translated into the security scans, and the output of those security scans need to be translated into, remediation, into resolutions. And ultimately, that's a lot of manual handoff and a lot of effort to make that translation. A lot of wasted time in our view, and maybe even redundant work, and very kind of rudimentary work that is done. The quality, the quality work isn't really being done at this stage. So I think we think that it's extremely important for everyone in the organization to have the ability to understand and the security compliance posture, so that they all can sort of have this single source of truth with all of these teams that make sure that they're all kind of working together in this unified tool, in this unified language. And the beauty of that is that once you have this common language and this common set of tools that you are working for and against, the efficiency starts to become more obvious, right? With that, you're able to have security and compliance that it's things that can be codified and automated. You're solving that problem. We talked about the peaks and the valleys we talked about before, because you're able to expedite them. They're being done faster and more frequent, which ultimately means you're consistently evaluating and you're consistently maintaining your compliance status. And the key thing here is that doing compliance as code allows you to, check your compliance status at any point in time in the system, even before production as you're working through, or even during production. So you're able to have a complete view of shift left if you're looking at it that way, or shift right as you're working towards maintaining your compliance state in production. How do you see this kind of different set of languages and different set of tools playing out there in the marketplace, Chris?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned it before. You talked about the different languages everybody speaks here. They all have separate tools, right? And that's cumbersome. They don't always have that common language. We can get SIMs and centralized, reporting from different types of systems to try to give us back some type of logic towards, what the state of our systems looks like. But you get sprawl, you get app sprawl, you get data sprawl, you get all kinds of different types of data back from all the different types of tools. So, where we look to align is through a common language, and that's as code, right? If we can do everything as code, and everybody's familiar with this, the coded enterprise, deploying infrastructure, deploying applications, having service catalogs where we can just order certain things and have them spin up in the cloud. We're constantly changing those environments, right? And trying to understand and keep them safe, right? That's the whole point to this, is to keep them safe and go fast. So if we can, bring together the three groups, and this is just a depiction. I mean, surely everybody has, some theory of, I've got a dev team, I've got a security team, and I've got an ops team who help me get, to that point in time where I can make things available for my customers. Then those folks have to get along. Well, we know the reality of that is sometimes they don't get along so well. But at least, they they try to marry up the needs of each different group and bring it all to one, so production looks like something that functions and is safe, and you can conduct your business in a productive manner, right?
Yeah, and back to kind of one element of this security as code, is really essentially having that common language shared among the teams, is really codifying the security and compliance, where the stakeholders, uh, from folks who care directly about the security and compliance to those that need to understand how it's being codified in order to certify that compliance, or even managing the security and compliance as code within the systems. So having that, the benefit of code that we see is it's something that allows it to be, a common language, which is human readable. The ability to scale, I think, is very important, that we talked about, that it's not just a single unit or device that you're looking at. You're able to replicate that very efficiently across your entire ecosystem. And not only on a data center setting, but also in a cloud instances. And so beyond that single purpose, you have a single tool that allows you that flexibility to go wherever your infrastructure needs for compliance and security are living, right? And that ability to really shift the security testing left, like I talked about, or even right. If you're working from a development side, you're shifting left, or from an operational side, you're shifting it right. So the ability to continuously monitor the status of your security and compliance is something that we believe is only done, you're only able to do it through code, because code is efficient, code is undeniable, code is the single source of truth. How do you envision that, Chris?
Yeah, no, I think it's a major, I think it's on top of everybody's mind, right? How do I get there? How do I do that? How do I take the applications, my historical applications, or my infrastructure as well, my network, everything, and compile it as code? Why? Very simply, it's much more agile. It's easier to process. It's easier to scale. It's a huge one, right? I can scale code readily, um, as opposed to trying to do acquisitions of hardware and infrastructure. And that's why everybody was so interested in why cloud works so well for some folks. But then again, cloud is maybe much more less secure, and it doesn't work as well for some folks, just understanding what it is that they're doing or what they're trying to deploy. But in terms of speed, when we go back to that inference of, hey, we've got speed, security, and price was the old adage in the day. To be able to do those things at speed, you've got to be able to do it, in a very agile manner. And it's not very agile to be, getting, bare metal or, other things to do. And we can increasingly get faster and faster. So that's the whole point of all of it.
Yeah. So you don't need to have speed or security. You can have them both. You can have the cake and eat it too, right?
Yeah.
So let's see, how does this kind of codification of compliance, or this compliance as code, kind of really work in unifying what we like to call the DevSecOps world, right?
Yeah. So if you look at the framework of what we might call a utopian production system looks like, we would have those three entities on the left that you talked about earlier, speaking a common language. Here's, the needs of these particular groups. We have to have, these particular things in order to, be permissible in production. And what we want to do is come up with a workload artifact, whether that's a piece of infrastructure, from an infrastructure as a service to an application to even a security policy. And I'll just speak to security policy in that fashion, because if you can codify your security policy, say, hey, we're moving from TLS 1.2 to 2.0. How do we do that in a codified manner? How do we check that? How do we ensure that it gets done? How do we build it into our CI/CD process and have the fleet respond to what it is that we've put out there? So in other words, a gold copy. Does that make sense, Alan?
Yeah, totally does.
Okay. So, and I welcome, by the way, as we go through this, I welcome any questions that we have through here. What I'm going to try to explain here now is kind of an operational view of how we see things. This is going to be a little bit more generic, but hopefully you get the idea behind what it is that we want to accomplish, because we have been talking about automation, number one, and I'm sure many of you are either looking at or doing automation already. But the challenges you might find in there, I'd love to hear about. But most of what I see in the market in terms of challenges for automation is, hey, it may not have made us as fast as we really wanted it to. Or if I have, say, for instance, a two-person rule for checking, I have no visibility or control over the entire system. Or, hey, great, I've automated this particular deployment of a thing, or I have access to a deployment of a thing, and that's fantastic. But at the same time, you realize, oh my gosh, I have access to all of those things, right? And that would be through, let's say in this inference, we would say we have some type of desktop system that has direct access to production, right? We have a manual way of getting into production and ensuring that alignment. I have visibility this way. I can look at all the stuff. I can make changes to all the stuff. But in general, what I see is maybe, this particular type of thing is trusted, but has a group of people who are using it. It takes, let's say, the modification of a policy, right? You first have access, then you're going to take a policy and or a set of, let's say, specifications that you want production to run in, and you're going to modify that. And then someone from your team is going to get on and make those modifications into production. And that tends to be, number one, least secure, right? And we're going to talk about what zero trust means to us. I hear a lot of people talking about zero trust in the industry. Having a number of people logging into a machine in a trusted scenario, modifying specifications, we see that is not so good, right? So you're going to want to get rid of this particular type of thing. Let's get rid of that access, number one, because if we talk about zero trust, what does that actually mean to you guys? Well, if you have a set of specifications, right, you want to keep those. You want to understand what those specifications are. Again, I mentioned it earlier, we called it ATO. How is it that we want to run? Do we want to run, and there was a question earlier that Sean asked, we want to run from a FedRAMP compliant standard, right? So those are those specifications. But we want automation to handle that for us, right? We don't want to be logging in directly and making those changes. So if we can automate that process, we will. But in our previous scenario where we had direct trust into production, we want to be able to review and test those modifications in an appropriate manner, right? So if you take these three elements, this is really the core of what we're talking about in automation. And the reason for that is because while you may have direct access and you can make those changes easily, you'll tend to get, let's say, policy sprawl, specification sprawl. You'll have a number of people doing different things. Alan may come into work hungover the next day late and you need something deployed quickly. Automation doesn't come in hungover, right? And if you can't review and test these things, what we find is, the modifications of those specific specifications will sometimes disenable you, right? You have a lot of dependencies and other things that are variants upon the stuff that you're manipulating. So to be able to modify and test those specifications, and specifically test and understand that it's going to work locally, we give you that ability right at dev, right? And so if you click on to the next one, what we do from that standpoint is we want to ensure that individuals are logging in, we know who they are, we're tracking the who, what, why, when, and where, right? And it's not a group login that anybody can get on and make those changes to. So we can go fast, right? Because if we know if the changes we make are going to work, we've already tested them, we've had insight into them, we're going to make the system go fast. That's the whole point of why we're doing this, right? So if you implement version control here, where you can share those things with the different members in your group, and everybody can go through the paces of, hey, I understand what changes were made. I'm looking at, the different things. I've got somebody checking those changes. Is it the gold standard? We can create a gold standard. This is something that we really, approve of because no one has direct access to production in this method, and it's being tracked completely. So what does version control do from there? For some of you advanced users, you know exactly where I'm going to go with this. We're going to try to push this into a CI/CD pipeline, right? So it can do all of the things and understand, hey, we've come up with this copy. We understand we want these changes to be made. We don't want it to break dependencies. We want to ensure that production is in quote unquote, 5 nines, which is a standard that we might not be using anymore if we're going all to a codified enterprise, right? We're looking at the actual code in the applications and not necessarily the infrastructure. So through that pipeline, we create zero trust. Nobody ever touched, the changes that you made to those specifications. It's going to go through build stage and tests. You can either deploy it into, a development operation, but what you want to ensure is that you've created something that works. It's pliable at runtime. It's going to be, as foolproof as it can be. And then you're going to want to store that into a secure repo. Let's take, for instance, this is a security policy, right? And we're making those changes from TLS 1.2 to 2.0. We can put that policy out there, make sure it runs through all its tests with the different types of configurations in production, and ensure that it's available for anything in the fleet to reference. So the reference in production says, hey, I see in the repo that we've changed the version in our policy. Maybe you have in your secure repo the latest and greatest versions of a piece of code you want to install, right? Take, for instance, recent security concerns with different types of applications. I won't name them here, but I think, the most recent one, hey, very simply, you're going to do a hash check. You're going to understand that this, hey, the number that we get in the checksum is going to be the original gold copy of that particular application. Nothing was added to it. It's been through test. We know that it works. It's not buggy. It's not compromised, and we can ensure that it gets into production safely. And it was just a checksum. That's all we needed to do to ensure that we got the right thing deployed to our stuff. So that's just one scenario of this. And I welcome any questions on this. I'm sure there's deviations from the type of flow, but as you can see, this is really, the zero trust method that we're talking about, because not only from the front end gateway where you can see everybody accessing production from that standpoint, 50% of the time we're making these changes through development operations, right? DevOps is making feature functionality and infrastructure changes to keep you in the latest and greatest brand new thing. And your speed to production really can dictate whether or not you beat your competition, whether or not you're getting the mission value that your agency was looking for. But then you're truly tracking, hey, I know zero trust that everybody is being logged and tracked, and I understand the changes and everything that's being done into production. So, sorry, that was a lot, Alan. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that resonates, and I think we kind of came up with a kind of a broader kind of security model that we see. We're calling the DevSecOps security model, where I think it exemplifies not only that section of the compliance area where you're talking about, but more other areas that you can kind of that mentality of automation going through code where you can see that applied. Right, you're going from the developers that are committing code with post a two-person review code, and at that point pretty much the automation takes over, and that zero trust environment, that hands-free zone or that human-free zone kind of takes over, right?
Oh my gosh, I love this. In terms of deploying code and the reliability of that code getting into production, this is excellent, right? It wasn't a human that got in and intervened and maybe messed up a comma or a quote or a bracket. It was all the system making those changes. From a security standpoint, I love this even more because you've shown me I can even implement human approval. I can integrate this into, say, a Jira or a ServiceNow or whatever type of tool that you're using and have visibility into what the system is actually doing, make approvals before it moves on to the next stage. This is awesome. But from a security standpoint, even better, a human-free zone. If I know Alan is logging into a server, into production, I know he shouldn't be, right? I can't tell you how many times I've chased wild gooses into, asking people why they've logged into servers into production only to find that they were looking for a picture from their kid's basketball game the previous week, right? It was nothing. But now I know, hey, nothing changes production other than system. And if somebody's logging in, it's 75 to 90% of the time going to be some type of lateral movement from a security standpoint, some type of infiltration from someone doing some type of unsavory behavior, right? Just trying to compromise your system. And that saves the security team a ton of time, and an understanding of, hey, if this stuff is all going through a pipeline and it's all automated, I know everything that gets into production is going to be in alignment and to standard. It's going to be secure because we were the ones who developed the policy. And if it made it into production, then we know it's set by those standards. So this is really good. I like this, Alan.
So that policy becomes the golden standard, right? The golden key of, okay, and which can be modified if needed, and when needed, right? It can be adjusted and adapted, and then that policy becomes proof of your compliance state as well, right? Because if it's always following this method and no other adverse changes are occurring, then that golden standard of policy becomes your golden standard of compliance, right?
Exactly. What would it be like if you just had a single security uh, policy and you changed it in that example? Hey, we're moving from 1.2 to 2.0. Ensure that we have the latest TLS 2.0 binary out there. It's the gold standard. It's been checked and proved. And then just change that single policy for the entire fleet to look at and say, oh, I see I'm moving into this new binary. I'm doing an upgrade. It's been checked. I know it's secure. I know at runtime I'm going to be up, and there's not going to be any outages. That's where we want to live.
Yeah, it's really cool. And then the obligatory kind of how we envision this being applied more specifically. So we were talking about general terms here, and we've launched a chef compliance offering in June of last year. So as we are going through this kind of the circle of life that we see, how chef compliance works in this compliance as code method, right? Where you have access to trusted content, which is aligned to industry benchmarks like CIS, the Center for Internet Security, or your DISA STIGs for your government situations, and where those benchmarks can help with your audit and the necessary remediation that occurs there. So with newly available remediation content, organizations can really ensure that these remediation actions align directly to the specific audit result. So there's a one-to-one kind of ratio. If there's an error, you can create a remediation immediately done all through code. There you have the definition stage, where Chef now makes it easy for you to define that compliance baseline or that policy that we talked about, and tune that to the organization's specific needs. So we come out with something that is CIS based, but allows you to modify it per needs of your specific organization or industry for that matter. It allows you that flexibility to implement compliance waivers, which allows for individual controls in order to avoid those false positives and misconfigurations, which can be time consuming and difficult to manage thereafter, right? So after that, you have the ability to kind of detect, you continuously monitor and evaluate the compliance posture by really detecting any deviations from that intended state at any point in the software development lifecycle. So it's really interesting how you're able to do that. And then ultimately, if remediation is needed, you're able to do that for non-compliance with the remediation capabilities of this tool that address those individual controls in alignment with the audit tests that were done in the previous steps, but really encoding those fixes to enable this continuous compliance state that we talked about. That way, remediation can be applied very easily without requiring much coding skills. We have YAML for the beginners, but if you truly want to be deep in the code, you also can use the Ruby code that's all this is based on. And ultimately, the reporting instances where you're able to maintain that comprehensive and up-to-date visibility across that heterogeneous estate that we talked about, right? To your, core machines on-prem in a data center through different environments, even devices, even laptops and desktops as we have offering from a desktop compliance state, but also through cloud instances in multiple states. So you easily view the differences between the baseline and the remediated state, but also track and monitor the waiver status and enable that to fast and accurate audits at any time, almost impromptu audits. It's very efficient to be done because you have the constant single pane of glass where you're able to have the audit and compliance state there all the time. And with that, the Chef compliance is built on the known technologies, what we've grown to know and love, and they offer different flavor. We offer it in different flavors. Chef Compliance Audit is really designed for the InfoSec and SecOps teams who wish to maintain a complete visibility over the compliance status of their estate. It provides this extensible audit content based, like I said, on the Center for Internet Security and the DISA Security Technology Implementation Guides, or STIGs, standards that can be easily tuned to meet specific corporate needs. Or you have the compliance remediation, which is really designed for the infrastructure and operations team to help close that loop between the audit and remediation, and really enabled the continuous compliance in the entire enterprise. New remediation functionality and trusted, standard-based content that we provide as a Chef Premium content really makes it easy for organizations to remediate issues that are uncovered during the audits without necessarily having to write extensive amounts of code. And we believe that only through that kind of compliance as code is where the key element of this compliance automation is to scan early and often. Like we talked, we're really shortening those elements down, and in your software development lifecycle, instead of performing compliance scans during the security last stage before production, you're likely to have this Chef compliance throughout your development lifecycle, enabling you to test continuously and move from one stage to the next very efficiently. This really eliminates that rework that we talked about, and often happens with that old approach, and allows everyone to really, from dev to QA to ops to security, to be on the same page, to be with the same language, with the same set of tools. So that's kind of how we envision this compliance as code working. And we're curious to have any questions out there. Please post them in the Q&A tab right there. We have about 10 minutes that we could still kind of go through some of the questions. I think there are a couple of comments here, Chris, that we see in the chat that was earlier. Is there any advice for getting past non-technical cloud governance boards that hold up compliance charges for months in bureaucracy?
Well, you know what I've seen, and I've talked to a number of third-party auditors. We are in constant contact with the Deloittes and EYs and other third-party groups who do a number of the audits. What has really been insightful for most auditing teams is that if you have a common language and it spells it out, and I think you had a piece of the code in a prior slide that showed how simple it was, right? It's telling you exactly what it's doing, where it got that standard and why and what version. It tells you all of that. It speeds up the audit entirely. It quickens that pace for the auditor to get through and give you those approvals. Is there any way around it? Well, naturally it comes with a vote of confidence from whoever's auditing you. If they come in and they see that, oh, hey, I see the way and style of which you do compliance, and they have an understanding of, hey, look, maybe some of them don't understand how to code, or they never saw a line or two of Java, but when they see something like this in plain English, they can easily walk through the things that they need in order to pass you. So as painless as it can be, it's never completely without its pain, but surely you can make it easier for you and your team.
Mm-hmm. There's actually a comment, not a question, but this attendee see those charts, the charts that we talked about, the audit charts, really to be accurate, and he loved the multiple that he's worked for multiple agencies that only cared about getting compliant for the audit date, but then switched back to this non-compliance once they were past the audit, so they weren't able to keep that compliance state. So interesting approach there.
Yeah, we talk about waivers in some of our stuff. Like a number of these templates, they CIS, and we're one of the only certified groups that CIS has anointed and given affirmation that the stuff that we're doing is good stuff, as well as Gardner. But not all of us need all of those standards, right? We don't need to have full up STIG compliance from a 171 or an 853 compliance alignment methodology. So what does that mean? Well, I have the ability to adjust those. I have the ability to check for other things that may be unique to my environment. I have the ability to put waivers in that tell you when the report is run, hey, look, we waived this particular control. This is a control that's compliant with, CIS, whatever number. And this is the reason why. And you can see who did that, and you can track it all the way through. It's really, for those of you who are familiar with secure supply chain, it's really the secure supply chain for code, right? Not only do you have the ability to test and understand why you're already linting and checking your code out as it goes through the pipeline, but as things are deployed out into the fleet, you can ensure that alignment can stay there. You talked a little bit about laptops. I had a couple customers ask me about work from home, and some agencies who came to me and said, hey, we were only budgeted for 60% of the workforce to be working from home. And then all of a sudden we went overnight to 100. How do you answer that, Chris? Well, is if you have a really optimized pipeline that you can start to put gold copies through and you can deliver it, you can churn out laptops like nobody's business, right? Overnight, you can do that as long as you have, the actual, product in hand and is deliverable. But more so, the concern is, how do I keep those things compliant? Well, we're going to put a small client on the end of each one of those laptops, and by policy, and you add that policy to the laptop saying, hey, registry value change. That means you can't, install new things, right? You can't change specific documentation. You can't take off certain applications. Maybe you want to give them the freedom to do those things. Well, how would you enforce that if it were off network? Well, you'd need a client to be able to do that. And obviously they can, and then they'll have that security policy there until they log into the next time, until it gets updated. So there are a lot of unique different use cases that customers will use this tool to remain in compliance, as a direct security tool, as a compliance auditing tool, as a way for visibility to understand and meet that CISO's risk compliance report in the morning. There are a number of different ways, and it's just, so this has been a great position for me past couple of years to be able to talk to customers who are implementing in such productive fashion. It's really been cool.
So really, you talk about implementation. I think this is a very practical question right here. It says, how could an enterprise move from a compliance audit kind of mindset to a compliance remediation? How would that flavor? How would that happen? Is it as simple as changing the package once the organization is ready to move on?
Well, it does vary depending on a couple of things, right? So the methodology that we talked about really revolves around the process that you have. It entails, how mature or optimized your pipeline is, how you're able to implement it. It involves getting test engaged early on in the process, right? If you have the ability to spin up a RHEL 7 box to test the actual policy that you're about to deploy locally before you actually get it to the CI/CD, it's going to go through CI/CD much faster. You have the ability to just deploy this right over the network. You don't have to integrate it into your pipeline. You can deploy it into your network, run these templates against your fleet, and understand where you're going to have to spend your time, right? That's where we really, what we're really interested in, right? I don't want to check a number of machines that are already compliant. I just want to ensure that I know which ones aren't and what I actually need to do to remediate them or get them in alignment. And if I can do that via code, even better. Remediation scripts are fantastic. They work very well. Being able to come back to you and report back to you. If you have a system that's reporting back to you, hey, I'm compliant as per policy version, 2100 that you just deployed last week, you can rest assured that, you're doing things right there and you're doing them at speed. So really exciting way to work from that methodology. But to your point, Alan, it does take some back end work. It does take some forethought and understanding of, hey, how do I want to set this up? How, what's my longevity for the actual framework? Am I in a state where, maybe I'm not as mature in my pipeline, but I'm doing some automated things. And I've seen the productivity to come out of it. I've seen the speed that we're capable of having. How do I get the most out of this? There's a number of ways to do it. There's plenty of consultants out there. In the last webinar, we had a great consultant on. We have our own, but there are plenty of people out there that understand the methodology. So I encourage you to get into the agileness and the advantageous qualities of automation in building out your enterprise, because it's going to save you a world of pain and trouble that I experienced for years. That's one of the reasons why I came to this company.
Right. And here's another question. So those, if you have any questions, we're still around. So post your questions on the Q&A tab, please. So here's one question, and appreciate the recognitions here. So Amy here recognized, she loves the idea of Chef being the single source of truth. I do our self-assessments for all of our required STIGs. And she's curious if there will be baselines for other non-OS STIGs, such as the application development and security STIG. That is 100% manual, no automation for it today. But it would be great to have a STIG, a single place to see how we are meeting the requirements in that STIG. How does that apply? Other than what is there and what the premium content, I want to caveat before you answer, Chris, is it's continuously updated. Not only if there are modifications to STIGs or to the CIS benchmark, we address those within a very short SLA, but also if new standards come to fruition, and we continue to update those and provide those. But go ahead if you'd like to answer, Chris.
Yeah, so someone answer automated through PowerShell. That's how I used to do it forever. And the only problem with that, though, I would say, is that you'll get sprawl, right? If you have all the different things, and if you've ever looked at a STIG regulation, you'll see all the different types of controls that you need to test and retest after versions, get updated and everything else. It gets just to be a bear. So having the ability to just pull down the latest and greatest STIG version and or CIS version and run it against the fleet makes it just your world just so much nicer. But in terms of development, right, Chef will give you the ability to run a thing called Test Kitchen. And via Test Kitchen, it will automate the spin up of infrastructure in the specific specifications that you like it to. And then you're able to run that code, lint that code, understand how that code is working from either a local or a cloud environment, wherever you choose to build those things up in terms of your architecture. So you can do that, very easily. And then as you get that code through, you can run that code to show different types of things, right? So if you have a piece of infrastructure you're running an application on, and all of a sudden it turns on port 21, you'll have that STIG template there watching that system during CI/CD to say, hey, your application is out of alignment. It's turned on port 21. That's not allowable in our particular case. Maybe it is. I don't know what your ATO is or your security policy is. And you have that ability to adjust, to be agile, to make that control change and ensure that everything that you're putting in to version control is tested prior to or during the whole process for CI/CD. Great question, Amy, by the way.
Yeah, just so you know, that slide that's been up for a while is what next steps you could do. There, you can visit the Chef Compliance webpage. There is a Chef compliance session in Learn Chef, which is available there. You can also, it's for free. You can just dive in a little deeper, and we'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this webinar, but also there's a human free zone white paper that kind of puts to words what Chris and I have been talking about in terms of codifying your compliance. So it's quite an interesting piece, and you'll be getting a copy of that in your emails going forward. If there aren't any other questions, Chris, I wanted to kind of have you close off with your final thoughts around the impact of compliance as code and how has that changed many of our customers, both public and private enterprises, but more importantly, how do you see that step in adopting compliance as code to impact these organizations in the future, really?
Yeah, and I guess I'll tail off the end of that question from Amy, right? I would leave you with this. The biggest part to some of the headaches that we have in operations, or as companies in general, is the marriage between applications and infrastructure, right? We tend to see our failures at runtime with different dependency changes on different types of things. Either it's going to be the OS dependencies or the application dependencies therein and any changes that were made. So being able to track that through and understand it is huge, right? Because that speeds our pace to be able to remediate and or recover from any failure that we see happen. But then if we're able to test during that time where we're actually deploying, we can ensure the reliability of that thing, whatever it is, it being able to work for us in a productive manner as we get it there. So from a security as code standpoint, to be able to take a third of the time to run through an audit through an entire enterprise, and not only have eliminated your variances and your inferences in terms of what you think or have visibility to in terms of the alignment of the security controls that's set therein. It really is a time saver. It saves you time. It saves you money, obviously. You can consolidate applications. You can consolidate product. You can consolidate data and actually drive your workforce, your current workforce, into where it is they want to be. You can spend more time looking at, the gateway and all the neat things, or all the people coming in, and ensuring that, your gateway is not being infiltrated, number one, but also, hey, you know what, in order to modify that policy, I'm going to be looking at the different types of people I'm interacting with and how they're doing it, what types of new vulnerabilities there are, what types of new infiltration techniques. I'm going to modify those policies as I see them. And the faster I'm able to do that, the faster I'm able to show less risk in that report every morning, right? It sometimes takes days for a 0-day compromise to be plugged up, right? And it's just, you're holding your breath the entire time that you're not the next one hit until you can get your production fleet shored up. Having it as code, the agileness in that, to be able to deploy it on an instant, have it tested and ensure it's going to work and doesn't break anything, that's worth its weight in gold from my standpoint. So I encourage everybody to get involved with it, try it in some form or fashion. I'm happy to help. Obviously, you can contact me here at Chef or Alan or anyone here. There's also plenty of consultants out there we're happy to recommend, but reach out to folks and ask them if they've heard of it. We're happy to answer any questions, and I appreciate the time today, Alan.
Great. Gozar, back to you for closing.
Thank you. Thank you to Alan and Chris and all of our attendees, and for our questions as well. So once again, the on-demand version and the Human Free Zone white paper will be available in a couple of days, and we'll email it to you as soon as it's ready. So with that, thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day.